These are the shocking statistics behind America's most dramatic urban collapse. Detroit, the Motor City, lost 61% of its population, filed for $18 billion in bankruptcy, and watched entire neighborhoods turn into ghost towns. This is the complete story of how the arsenal of democracy became a symbol of American decline. Detroit's collapse wasn't a sudden event. It unfolded as a slow-motion disaster spanning decades. In 1950, Detroit stood as America's fourth largest city with 1.85 million residents, serving as the beating heart of the nation's manufacturing economy. By 2015, only 680,000 people remained, which dropped Detroit out of the top 20 American cities for the first time since 1850. No major American city has ever experienced such a devastating transformation. To understand how catastrophic this decline truly was, consider this. Between 2000 and 2010 alone, Detroit lost 237,500 residents, more people than fled New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The city that once put America on wheels had become a cautionary tale of what happens when everything goes wrong at once. The seeds of Detroit's destruction were planted at the height of its success. After World War II, Detroit embodied the American dream. The city had served as the arsenal of democracy, churning out tanks and aircraft that helped win the war. When peace came, those same factories switched back to making cars for a nation ready to hit the open road. This was the legacy Henry Ford had built with the Model T and the massive River Rouge plant, transforming Detroit into America's automotive capital. Jobs were plentiful, wages were high, and the future seemed limitless. But the success contained a fatal flaw. Detroit had put all its eggs in one basket. The auto industry wasn't just important to the city, it was everything. In 1950, 56% of all automobile manufacturing employment in the United States was concentrated in Michigan. This level of economic dependence would prove disastrous when the industry began to change. The first warning signs appeared earlier than most people realize. From 1946 to 1956, the big three automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, built 25 new assembly plants in the greater Detroit metropolitan area. Not one of these plants was located within the city limits of Detroit itself. In 1940, 58% of Ford's assembly plants operated in Detroit proper. By 1956, that number had dropped to zero. Henry Ford II announced this factory decentralization strategy in 1950, seeking cheaper land and lower taxes in the suburbs. The jobs were moving out, but many Detroiters did not realize the implications yet. The exodus of manufacturing would eventually hollow out the city's tax base and strand hundreds of thousands of workers in an increasingly jobless urban core. The racial dynamics of Detroit's decline cannot be ignored. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans north to work in the auto plants, particularly during and after World War II. By the 1960s, Detroit was home to one of the largest black urban populations in the country and a thriving Motown music scene that would make the Motor City famous worldwide. But as jobs moved to the suburbs, discriminatory housing practices prevented most black families from following. The tensions that had been building for years exploded on July 23, 1967. It started with a police raid on an illegal after-hours club called a Blind Pig, where a welcome home party was being held for two returning Vietnam War veterans. The police arrested all 82 patrons, and as the crowd watched the arrests, frustration boiled over into 5 days of devastating riots. The numbers tell the story of that chaos. 43 people died, 7,200 were arrested, and more than 2,500 buildings were looted, damaged, or destroyed. The property damage, adjusted for inflation, reached $322 million, making it one of the 10 costliest civil disorders in American history. But the true cost went far beyond dollars and buildings. Coleman Young, who would become Detroit's first black mayor in 1974, later wrote about the riot's lasting impact. Detroit's losses went a hell of a lot deeper than the immediate toll of lives and buildings. The riot put Detroit on the fast track to economic desolation, mugging the city and making off with incalculable value in jobs, earnings taxes, corporate taxes, retail dollars, sales taxes, mortgages, interest, property taxes, development dollars, investment dollars, tourism dollars, and plain damn money. The white flight that followed was staggering. Approximately 1.4 million of the 1.6 million white residents in Detroit after World War II eventually left for the suburbs. By the 1980 census, the city had transformed from 55% white to just 34% white in a single decade. Detroit had become a majority black city, but it was also a city losing its middle class and tax base at an alarming rate. The economic devastation accelerated through the 1970s and the 1980s. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 hammered the auto industry, which had been slow to adapt to changing consumer preferences for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Foreign competitors, particularly from Japan, began capturing significant market share with better built, more reliable cars. The human cost was enormous. Detroit lost over 140,000 manufacturing jobs in the years following the 1967 riots. The Detroit 3's UAW workforce plummeted from more than 650,000 in 1978 to just 135,000 in 2010. United Auto Workers membership across the country fell from 1.5 million to just over 300,000 during the same period. As jobs disappeared, so did hope. Detroit's poverty rate skyrocketed from 14.9% in 1970 to over 33% by the 2000 census. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned as residents who could afford to leave did so, leaving behind those who lacked the resources to escape. The city began to resemble a war zone, with block after block of empty houses and shuttered businesses. The Packard automotive plant became an iconic symbol of this decay. Once a proud symbol of American manufacturing, the complex shut down in 1958. The last tenant moved out in 2010, and since then, sections have literally begun to collapse. For decades, it stood as a monument to industrial decline, its broken windows and crumbling walls appearing in countless documentaries about urban decay. By 2012, the scale of abandonment was almost incomprehensible. Detroit had 40 square miles of vacant land, nearly a third of its total area. About 78,000 vacant and abandoned structures surrounded the remaining residents, creating an eerie landscape of urban prairie dotted with the skeletons of a once great city. The city's financial situation grew increasingly desperate. Municipal services began to break down as the tax base continued to shrink. Police response times ranged from 20 minutes to nearly an hour. Fire stations had to improvise with empty pop cans and printers to receive emergency alerts because the technology was so outdated. Streetlights went dark. Public transportation became unreliable. The pension crisis illustrated just how broken the system had become. For nearly 25 years, the city had been paying out 13th-month checks, essentially bonus payments to retirees that contributed to pension fund insolvency. While municipal workers received an average pension of just $19,000 per year, the unfunded liabilities had grown to $11 billion. Meanwhile, the city continued with plans for a $444 million arena for the Detroit Red Wings, highlighting the skewed priorities that had contributed to the crisis. The final blow came with the election of Kwame Kilpatrick as mayor in 2002. At just 31 years old, the charismatic politician seemed to represent hope for the city's future. Instead, he embodied everything that had gone wrong with Detroit's leadership. Kilpatrick's administration was riddled with corruption on a scale that shocked even cynical observers. FBI Special Agent Robert Beekman later said that criminal activity was a way of life for Kilpatrick, and that he constantly used the power of his office to look for new opportunities to make money illegally. Kilpatrick was eventually convicted on 24 federal felonies, including racketeering, extortion, and tax evasion, and he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. By 2013, Detroit was beyond broke. The city owed $18 billion to creditors, including $11 billion in pension-related liabilities. The general fund deficit had reached $327 million. Most telling, 47% of property owners had not paid their 2011 property taxes, a sign that even those who remained in the city had lost faith in its future. Governor Rick Snyder appointed an emergency manager to take control of the city's finances, effectively suspending local democratic governance. The emergency manager, Kevin Orr, concluded that bankruptcy was the only option. On July 18, 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Bankruptcy forced deep changes in how the city would manage its obligations. Governor Snyder said that this was a difficult step, but the only viable option to address a problem that had been 6 decades in the making. Judge Stephen W. Rhodes confirmed the city's eligibility for bankruptcy, wiping about $7 billion in debt and allowing Detroit to restructure its obligations through the Grand Bargain, a unique agreement that protected the Detroit Institute of Arts collection from being sold to pay creditors. But even in its darkest hour, Detroit began to show signs of life. Dan Gilbert, the founder of Rocket Mortgage, made a $6 billion bet on the city's comeback, moving his company headquarters downtown and investing in dozens of properties. Gilbert later said that Detroit was probably at the bottom of the barrel in this country, from crime and unemployment to everything in between, and that it had been a 180-degree comeback. The recovery has been real but uneven. Since exiting bankruptcy in 2014, Detroit has balanced its budget every year and built up a $150 million rainy day fund. Police response times have improved dramatically, dropping from up to an hour to about 12 minutes. More than 25,000 abandoned houses have been razed, and 15,000 have been or are being renovated. Most remarkably, crime has plummeted. In 2024, Detroit recorded 203 homicides, the lowest number since 1965, and a 33% drop from just 2 years earlier. Non-fatal shootings fell by 25%, creating a sense of safety that the city had not experienced in decades. For the first time since 1957, Detroit's population has begun to grow again. The city gained 1,852 residents between July 2022 and July 2023, bringing the total to 633,366. It's a modest increase, but symbolically enormous for a city that had seemed locked in permanent decline. Major corporations are returning. General Motors moved its global headquarters to the newly renovated Hudson's Detroit building in 2025. Ford restored the magnificent Michigan Central Station as its Mobility Innovation Center. J.P. Morgan Chase has invested over $2 billion in the city's revitalization. The Renaissance Center, once a symbol of failed urban renewal attempts, now anchors a genuinely revitalized downtown. Yet challenges remain. The recovery has been concentrated downtown and in a few select neighborhoods, while much of the city continues to struggle. Detroit's poverty rate remains at 33.2%, more than double the national average of 15.1%. Unemployment sits at 8.2%, nearly twice the national rate. Most troubling, the recovery has not been equally distributed across racial lines. While Detroit's population has stabilized, the city has lost about 295,000 black residents since 2000, more than any other American city. Over the last decade, the median income of white Detroiters rose 60%, while for black residents, the increase was just 8%. Critics argue that the billions in private investment have created a tale of two cities, a gleaming downtown surrounded by neighborhoods that look much as they did during the worst years of the crisis. Peter Hammer, a law professor at Wayne State University, notes that corporate and philanthropic investments have been concentrated downtown and have not done enough to help the neighborhoods that need it most. The story of Detroit serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of hope. It demonstrates how quickly a great American city can fall when multiple crises converge: economic dependence on a single industry, racial tensions, political corruption, and misguided policy decisions. The reliance on automobiles over public transit, the promotion of suburban sprawl over urban investment, and the failure to address racial segregation all contributed to the collapse. But Detroit's story also shows that even the most devastated places can begin to recover with the right leadership, investment, and community commitment. The city that was once written off as beyond saving has balanced its budgets, reduced crime, and attracted billions in new investment. Detroit's collapse was the result of choices by individuals, corporations, and governments that prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Its recovery suggests that different choices can lead to different outcomes, even after decades of decline. The Motor City's journey from boom to bust to tentative recovery offers lessons for any community facing economic transition. Cities cannot depend on a single industry forever. Racial and economic segregation creates vulnerabilities that will eventually explode. Corruption destroys the trust necessary for effective governance. And recovery requires not just investment, but investment that benefits all residents, not just those in the most visible areas. Detroit collapsed because everything that could go wrong did go wrong, all at once, over decades. But its ongoing recovery proves that with commitment, leadership, and hope, even the most broken places can be rebuilt. The arsenal of democracy may never again be what it once was, but it can become something new, a symbol not of decline, but of resilience.